In a previous video I showed how I modified and improved a basic Hornby ex-Caledonian pug loco. At the end of the video I showed the shots you can see again now of it running slowly over one of my old Insel frog points, and commented that the loco sometimes ran through the point okay and sometimes it didn't. As the loco is partly to be used for shunting, I was not altogether happy with its performance, so have come up with a further idea to hopefully improve things. A quick check confirmed that the loco already picks up current from all four wheels, so the cunning plan this time is to have extra pickups on a wagon which will be attached to the loco. It will be wired through to the loco using a miniature plug and socket in much the same way as I did with my four-wheel coaches. If this works, it will be prototypical as the real Caledonian Class 611 and indeed North Eastern Railway Class Y9 used to have just such wagons in tow. They were used amongst other things to keep coal in, as the locos themselves had very small bunkers. The wagons were often homemade by the local depots and invariably had very short wheelbases. The plan is to use the chassis from the Hornby shunters wagon, as it not only has a very short wheelbase, it also has footboards for the shunters to ride on when shunting wagons. I am hoping to add a body which will look a little like the real thing, although looking at photos, the prototype wagons varied quite widely in appearance. My highly detailed scale drawing shown here shows the general idea. The front half, nearest the loco, should resemble a four-plank open wagon which will be filled with coal. The rear, which will be lower in profile, will hold the important other necessities such as the shunter's bicycle. The completed wagon will be quite light, so if there's room I will add some lead sheet to give extra weight. There will be quite a lot of alterations to the Hornby chassis, and the body will need to be scratch built. I will take my time over this build and hope to end up with a reasonable model of a rather different prototype. There is not much room in the loco, and to avoid having to make any major alterations to it, I've decided to run the wiring under the chassis. Phosphor bronze strips have been glued to the chassis and pickup wires soldered to them. The wires bear lightly on the backs of the rear driving wheels, there and there. The strips will have wires running from them to a miniature plug. For various reasons I am putting the plug on the loco and the socket at the front of the wagon. The main one is that if the socket were on the loco, under the chassis, plugging and unplugging it when not required would be a bit of a faff. The body of the shunters wagon has now been constructed out of 1mm sheet plasticard and using plasticard strips for detailing. A rectangular hole has been cut out of the front to accommodate the miniature socket. Pickup wires will lead from it to the wheels through two small holes drilled in the floor of the wagon body. Holes have been drilled in the wagon sides and handrails fitted for the shunters to hang on to. I have used the Hornby handrails, suitably shortened to fit, and as usual the fitting of these tested my bodgelling skills to the limit. My inability to use superglue didn't help much either, but at least they are on now. I hope that the long tails on the insides of the wagon won't show once the wagon is painted and the coal load is added. The top view of the shunters wagon shows I have removed what I think was the toolbox and also the upper handrails, which have been reused on my new body. The pickup wires are loosely held in place by blue tack to save them being damaged until they can be glued in permanently. The wagon as supplied has Hornby's latest version of small couplings fitted into NEM sockets. Although they look neat and nice, I have found they do not work too well when coupled to the older, larger couplings that are fitted to my Pug. I have sharp radius 1 curves, and this mixture of coupling types can lead to derailments. The new couplings have therefore been removed and replaced with some older, larger ones I found in my spares box. If you have larger radius curves, there should be no problem. The wheels have been replaced with some from an old Hornby LMS brake van, the one with the working light at one end. This picked up current on 2 wheels using a brass strip rubbing on each axle. I want current pickup to be on all 4 wheels, so I'm using my tried and tested method utilising pickup wires bearing lightly on the backs of the wheels. The wagon has a very short wheelbase, so there's not much room for wiring, but somehow even a bodgeller such as me managed to squeeze it all in. Phosphor bronze strips were glued to the underside of the chassis and the pickup wires soldered to them. Wires carrying the current to the loco were also soldered to the phosphor bronze strips and fed up through holes in the floor of the wagon. The wagon body has had lead sheet weights fitted, and the body has been glued to the chassis. The red and black pickup wires have been fed through and soldered to the miniature socket, which has been glued in place on the wagon floor. The socket and the miniature plug which is on the loco were purchased from Layouts for You. A false coal load has been loosely placed in the wagon to cover the miniature socket. It is not glued in place in case there's a problem with the wiring and access to the miniature socket is required. The wagon is now completed, painted and weathered. I think it's come out rather well, and the body at least looks like my original intention. Below the body is not quite what I originally intended, and the GWR shunters chassis looks rather too modern and mainline. But the chassis does have one major plus point. It works, and hopefully it works well. Any attempts on my part to scratch build the chassis would no doubt have resulted in me consigning the whole project to the waste paper bin. At the rear of the wagon there is a representation of the shunter's pole. Pickup wires have now been soldered to the phosphor bronze strips under the loco and to the miniature plug at the other end, ready to be connected to the wagon. The wires are hopefully long enough to give flexibility on curves, but not too long as to be obvious when the loco is on the layout. The loco and wagon have now been electrically connected, and it's time to see whether my rather Heath Robinson wiring setup actually works. A battery is applied to the rear wheels of the wagon. Hey, brilliant! Current is transmitted to the loco and its wheels revolve smoothly. The battery is then applied to the front pair of wheels. And again, success, loco wheels turning as before. I must say I'm rather pleased and not a little surprised at how well this project has turned out. A couple of thoughts have occurred to me at this point. Firstly, the wires from the loco are a little long, which means they would get in the way when running light engine. As I don't intend running the pug on its own, this doesn't matter to me. However, it might have been better to make a join between the plug and the socket about halfway between the loco and the wagon. That way the loco could be run on its own. But the object of this exercise was to achieve consistent slow running over insulfrog points, hence the construction of the shunter's truck. So the length of the wires between the loco and the wagon doesn't bother me, but it might you if you want to run light engine. Secondly, I'm a little concerned about the durability of the soldered joints on the miniature plug. Constant flexing as the loco and wagon goes round curves may weaken and eventually break either the wire and or the solder, so maybe a small piece of shrink tubing should have been fitted to strengthen this area. The completed unit posing for the official photo on my bench. Once I'm happy with the performance, I will disguise the wiring with some dirty brown paint. And now some shots of the completed unit running very slowly over the insulfrog points at the entrance to my station. Cleared that point okay. And that one. Not bad, eh? And now the point is switched the other way, leading into platform 2. Again, no problem whatsoever in passing over that point. And this is at a very, very slow speed for a basic Hornby pug. Not bad, eh? Well, that's all for now. See you next time.